Hey, I'm Zach Burns. You might remember me from such stations as Cairo Radio and KUOW. And now here I am on YouTube and Facebook. And I'm joined tonight with two people that I really love talking to. Christopher, your beard is outlandish. I don't know why I didn't notice that right away.
My COVID beard.
That is a COVID beard if I've ever seen one.
Into COVID chic, and until the pandemic is over, we are not grooming ourselves.
At the beginning, they said, "Don't touch your face," and I took that very seriously.
I've talked to her before. I've talked to him before. Amanda Knox and Christopher, thank you so much for joining me tonight. There's pretty much the goal of this show. I'm doing it with Terry Holloman, who again should be along any time now. We're just trying to have some comfortable conversations about uncomfortable topics, and there's not really a comfortable topic to be had anymore. I mean, there's three major world crises going on at the same time. We have pretty much a burgeoning depression, which normally would be like headline news, but now it's barely even.
Now it's an afterthought.
yeah, as is coronavirus, which is a bit of an afterthought right now. And then, of course, we have the racial tensions that are, generating a lot of protests here in Seattle and of course, nationwide. While most of us are just trying to figure out what to do with our days, how to get along. So I'm kind of curious, the two of you, how are you spending your days?
I think we're spending our days the way we always spend our days, Pinky, is trying to take over the whole world. No, I mean, we're asking a lot of questions. I think for me, at least, I came from a very safe and privileged background and was thrust into a very unjust and unprivileged position. And that definitely opened my eyes to a lot of systemic injustices that are realities. And I've been asking myself why and how those systems came into place in the first place. And actually we took a walk today to try to get some vitamin D because we heard that's a really good way to fight off COVID.
Yes, I heard that too. Yeah.
I think the thing that's been really sort of odd for us recently is this sort of talking about injustices, especially within the criminal justice system, is something that I've been living with and thinking about and talking about for over a decade. And suddenly it's become a big mainstream topic. And on the one hand, I'm really excited about that because it's finally, I'm not just sort of shouting into a void of no one caring about an issue that I care deeply about. People are more open to ideas that have been proposed by the radical, criminal justice reformists. But on the other hand, I also think suddenly a whole boatload of people are entering into the conversation with varying degrees of familiarity and thoughtfulness about the topic. And I almost feel like I'm worried about how there's been so much work that has been put into this issue that I'm afraid is getting flooded with memes and sloganing that is not very nuanced, that is very black and white. So,
and the loudest voices aren't always the most cogent voices, often aren't,
Of course not.
So I mean, yeah. It's just an interesting.
What slogans? What slogans are you referring to, Amanda?
I mean, even just the sort of big one right now is abolish the police.
Yeah.
Defund
the police,
and
right? Yeah.
Right? So abolish the police comes with a lot of extra slogans attached to it, like ACAB and
all cops are bastards, right?
Are we allowed to swear on your show?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
So it's another thing. You're drinking wine. You're hopefully going to swear.
We're getting
These are things that I want a guest to do, and just do it, days. Yeah, the all cops are bastards thing.
All cops are bastards. I've heard some people talking about how all of the problems within law enforcement and the criminal justice system all sort of derive from racism, and I think that that's also oversimplified. And I think that a lot of the proposals for how to fix issues are based on a very simplified understanding of what the problems are, and I'm afraid that they're not actually going to address the issues, and they're going to empower the communities that need to be empowered.
And they may backfire and empower the wrong kinds of things. May stimulate certain realities that we would dread even more. And one we've been worrying about with Abolish the Police is what happens if the Amazons of the world start privatizing their own security, right, because they can't count on city governments to do it for them. And so now what you have in Salt Lake Union is the Amazon police.
Right. And they're only serving the Amazon employees. They're not serving the interests of everyone. And granted, it can be argued that right now the police are not serving the interests of everyone, and that is definitely an issue. But technically, they're legally bound to serve the interests of everyone, so we can hold them accountable to that. But if we enter a system of privatized law enforcement, you're going to be entering into a world where privatized law enforcement officials who are empowered to carry guns like we are in our country are going to be bound not really to the law so much as to their Amazon executives.
Yeah, I mean,
they would be an internal Halliburton essentially.
Totally.
The privatized forces that we send overseas to not really have the public accountability that our military does. That's actually an angle that I hadn't thought of as of yet. I'm hoping that cooler heads prevail.
Rich people are gonna not want to protect their shit.
It's the same issue with public schools. People want to distribute, get rid of property taxes and distribute, the funding for public schools evenly, so you get rid of the disparities where schools in wealthy neighborhoods are much more funded than schools in poor neighborhoods. Yeah. But it's one consequence of just banishing that is all of a sudden the people in wealthy neighborhoods are going to take their money and shuttle their kids into private schools. So unless you ban private schools, one consequence of that is just depopulating the public school system, which also doesn't sound like a good idea. So it's we can all agree that unequal funding for schools is a bad thing, but just mandating that they all have equal funding is a solution that comes with new problems.
Yeah.
It's if you do identify as a progressive, you would have to admit we're terrible at branding, because defund the police is a conversation that I don't think a lot of people who, on the right that you would want to bring and sway towards your direction would even want to have, because defund the police sounds terrifying. And even most people who think that there should be a different tack taken in terms of policing in this country don't want to defund the police. And yet that's the phrase that got out there first. And it's frustrating to me, because it's before we can even talk about how policing should look, in 2021 and going forward, it's kind of like with the Black Lives Matter movement. It was before you could even talk about what that meant, you had to first win over someone who loves saying all lives matter or blue lives matter or whatever it is. We're bad at branding.
We are. And I think the one thing that and Chris was really astute at talking about this today, we were talking about this earlier, is being able to, there's two separate things going on. Right now, we're seeing people being very, very good at diagnosing that there's a problem.
Right.
And being actually surgical at diagnosing what the problem is and where the problem is most affecting our communities and how it's having a broader impact. We're super good at identifying the problem. Being good at identifying the problem does not necessarily mean you are necessarily the best at identifying the solution. And a good metaphor for this is Chris was talking about his book editors, and when he's writing a novel, I don't want to speak.
Yeah, you have an editor at a publishing house telling you, redlining the manuscript, telling you to cut things, and often I would find that I violently disagreed with the suggestions of my editor. But what would end up happening is I would say, no, you can't cut that character. That character is instrumental that's important to the moral journey of this other protagonist. And then they'd say, oh, well, that didn't come across to me. And you have a discussion that's like, okay, well, that character felt instrumental to me, but that clearly wasn't coming across. My editor's solution was get rid of that character. Right. And my solution was, no, I failed in my job of showing why that was an important character. I need to restructure it and rewrite it to fix what my vision was to begin with. And we eventually reached an agreement. And I realized, like, you know, she was really good at identifying what wasn't working.
But not.
And I give her credit for that, you know. But the idea that she had to solve that problem was not the idea I liked.
Just throw it out the window, you know.
Right, get rid of that.
Right.
There was a better solution, and it took us talking through it together.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that sort of mentality, because I think it's a great analogy between writer and editor, between the relationship between CHOP and the SPD, the Seattle Police Department. Are you hopeful that those sort of conversations and those sort of understandings would happen between the two organizations? We have CHOP now and SPD. Is it possible that they can come to some sort of agreement that'll be at least somewhat satisfying to both parties? Because the SPD is not going to forever give up the East Precinct. So when they decide to re-enter, do you see there being any possibility that that's going to be a peaceful transition, or are they just two people that are two groups that are never going to ever be able to reconcile their existence?
You know, honestly, like, I can't say that I know enough about either group of people to say for sure what their interaction will be. I know that, like, I have a lot of questions, and a lot of things are happening right now that raise questions for me about what is going to happen. For instance, the shootings recently in CHOP.
Yeah.
Like, if there are shootings in CHOP, who is charged with investigating those shootings? So far, we know that SPD is investigating those shootings, but in what capacity? And is their capacity limited because the shootings happened in CHOP, or is CHOP welcoming police intervention in trying to determine who is committing violence in their community? Like, those are questions that I have that I don't have answered because they literally just happened, and I don't actually know any of the, like, key figures who established CHOP. But those are questions.
Well, I don't think anybody has answers to that yet, because nobody was expecting any sort of gun violence. And then for one incident, you could say, okay, this was an ancillary event. Yeah, right.
I mean, like, this country is so different than any other industrial, rich, educated democracy, in that the number of lethal, deadly weapons that we just have available to us. And I think that just really complicates the equation, which is why, like, you know, I'm not sitting here pretending that I have any inkling of what the answers are. It's just, you know, Chris and I have spent the last 3 months asking questions of people from different backgrounds in all of this. Like, just the other day, I was interviewing a former FBI agent who's, like, very pro law enforcement. And just before that, I was interviewing a formerly incarcerated individual who was very anti-law enforcement. And so, like, I'm trying myself, like, I can honestly say I've never imagined a world without police. I know that some people have, and they might have better answers than I do. I know that what my experience has been with police, how, like, you know, how police are human beings in all of the best and worst ways that people are people, that they're biased, and that they, just like the rest of us, they have ego, and they make mistakes, and they worry about their reputation, and they want to make sure that they get their paycheck, and they don't want to be looked down upon, and they don't want to have to apologize. And, like, human beings are making those mistakes all the time. Police should be held to a higher standard because they have a technical monopoly on violence. So they really need to hold that monopoly to a higher standard. And I think for me, the thing that I want to see that would do a great amount of good is more accountability. Like, the kinds of ways that police accountability and prosecutorial accountability has just been chipped away at for the past 40 years until it's nothing. Like, prosecutors and police can basically do whatever they want without being accountable to anyone. is insane. And so even the people that I speak to who are very much pro law enforcement are like, we fucked it up. Like, we've been protecting each other at the expense of everyone else, and we fucked up.
As someone who's experienced the media, and I don't even mean necessarily the news media, but in your instance, it definitely was shaping what your identity is. I'm usually against things just that have been institutions being taken away, but I think it's great that Cops got canceled, because that has not been, that's not really been, it's been a weird recruiting tool for people who.
You talking about the show or
the show? Yeah. No, when I say defund the cops, I mean the thing that airs on the Paramount network between like 2 and 4 p.m. Because it was humiliating to people who didn't really need to be humiliated at the lowest point in their lives. Someone was telling me the other day that a friend of someone who appeared on Cops informed that they had been on Cops, and they never even knew that they were, because they were so whacked out on meth. And they have you sign a release form, but when you're about to be incarcerated, a release form sounds like something you'd actually want to sign. But it was the people at their worst at the worst moments of their lives being pushed around with the audience cheering by cops. And that's just one of many examples of kind of the misrepresentation of what that job should be. There are very few shows. I watched and loved The Shield, and I did not like Michael Chiklis's character until he turned on his other guys. Like, that's not the way cops should be represented. And I think that we've never really had a responsible TV show or a responsible film about what it is to be a police officer, because that would be kind of boring. So I think that you have generations now of people who are interested in getting into police work based on the films and TV shows that they've seen about being in police work.
It's funny. Like, I've had the rare moment. Like, I've had several moments where I was like, you know what? I should probably become a police officer, because I would be like responsible. But like,
the nice thing about canceling Cops is that it's propaganda, right? I'm all in favor of canceling propaganda, left, right, and center. Let's get rid of propaganda.
Yeah.
Something like, David Simon's The Wire shows a complicated police force that it is filled with people who, some of whom were really morally driven and trying to do a good thing. Some of whom are social climbers trying to secure their position of authority in an institution, like people do throughout the world. Some of whom are outright corrupt and are on the take. And some of whom are racist assholes and bigots. Some of whom are prone to violence, and some of whom are really fighting against that. And some of whom are dipshits who accidentally shoot their weapons. Like, The Wire is not a very good propaganda film.
And it shows them changing. Like, even what's his face, the Irish one, who's like, he's a good cop when he's not drinking, but he's a bad cop when he's drinking. And like, you know, like, anyway.
So like going back to your question about if the SPD and the BLM abolish the police type protesters can come together, I think my sad analysis is that no, they probably won't. And one reason for that, imagine if you were in the SPD headquarters, surrounded by pictures of police lieutenants and hallowed martyrs of policedom, and with big placards saying law and order and all these things. And then they said, hey, come in here and have a discussion with us. Have an honest discussion about police violence. I think rightly so, a lot of the people on the protest side would say, really, you want to have an honest discussion with us surrounded by all this propaganda? I don't believe you that you're going to faithfully engage with me. Mm-hmm. And when you walk the shop right now, it's the same thing in reverse to my eyes. You see ACAB sprayed everywhere. And it's like, well, if you have all cops are bastards there, you're not ever going to win any cops over to your side. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of instrumental for this whole thing. Both sides claim to want to have an honest conversation, and you can't have an honest conversation when you're in your den of propaganda,
Yeah, CHOP. Have you been? I know that you have. I said this last week too. It feels a lot to me like the 2011 Occupy protests, which began actually with great messaging. We are the 99%, which, and everybody had been ripped off by a bank at that point if you weren't absolutely rich, whether it be something as meager as an overdraft fee when you're already struggling. And yet we were able to squander it because all it became about, I was living in Portland at the time, and there were encampments all over the country, if you remember. And the encampment in Portland just came about the preservation of the encampment, and the message sort of got lost. And the last few times that I've been in shop, because I work not too far from there, so I usually just kind of see what's going on. It's got a very similar feeling in that it's about the preservation of CHOP, and the message of Black Lives Matter has been largely lost.
Interesting.
And that's the entire point of CHOP, right? Like it was instituted because of the
because of a legit problem. Like people were like, "Here's a legit problem, and until someone pays attention to it, we're just going to sit around and be mad." Right?
But it's really analogous to coronavirus. It's just like, maybe we just don't have the attention span to focus on one issue for too long. Like we can do it for a while, and then we kind of want to move on to something else. And that's what CHOP is starting to feel
like. Prison experience is so valuable because I can't tell you how many days I was like, you know what? I am so done with prison today.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how much I'm done with prison today. I'm still in prison.
Yeah.
Like that. And I feel like I can appreciate how, I don't know, like a part of me wonders if like half the people who are out in the streets right now are out in the streets just because they're tired of being at home. And that's sort of unsettling as well, is like, what are people's genuine motivations? Like, we're all human animals and we want to be a part of a human organism. And if the human organism, the only one that we're allowed to be a part of is one that's protesting in the streets, is that something that's motivating people? I mean, that could be a very true thing, and that's a very human thing, and no judgment on that, but like that's probably motivating a number of people.
I would say that's a massive factor in this. I think without COVID, we're not seeing the sort of response to the murder of George Floyd that we're seeing right now.
I also think it's a broader, kind of deeper issue of human meaning, and that in our sort of modern consumerist society, the weird decaying product of the Enlightenment that has peaked in like sometime in the early 21st century, a lot of people don't feel like they have a lot of deep fulfillment in their lives. They work their jobs, they sock away little to no money. They probably have student loan debt. It's a generation of people who don't see their futures looking brighter than their parents' lives.
Most of the time we're given some sort of like false, petty, like moral position that we can take. Like the big, like I would love to recall that like the thing before George Floyd that was all the rage during COVID was Tiger King.
Yeah.
And everyone was like up in arms about Tiger King.
Yeah.
And like yes, that's like a tale of like somebody's in prison right now, and that's a big deal. But like, I don't think that's the main reason why people were obsessed with Tiger King. They were obsessed with like sort of judging them in a petty way.
Well, like when you don't have deep, I mean, religiosity declined precipitously in the last like 50 years. Not that I'm a fan of religion, but like that was one major source of meaning in people's lives. The family unit has disintegrated to a big degree. Also, not that I would ban divorce or something, but like one consequence of the that freed women from domestic violence and all those things is that we have fewer stable family units as a proportion of society than we used to. Stable is a obviously loaded term.
Yeah, I was about to say.
It means that you have people on the left and the right. And I think like the rise of Trumpism is also, and Black Lives Matter, those things both are explainable by a deep lack of meaning that people feel that pushes them towards tribalism and virtue signaling. because it's a way to find meaning and purpose when you otherwise feel adrift, is to be part of a movement. You know,
Right.
if you don't feel like you're a part of a movement, then what are you? What are you doing? You're just buying shit on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
And that's depressing.
Which used to be okay. Like when you got your Sears Roebuck catalog in 1958 and you bought some stuff from it, whether it be a new washing machine or whatever it was, you found meaning in that. And I guess with consumerism, we're not, just because it's so much easier to
click on something from Amazon. Different, right? Like the standards of living changed, right? Like suddenly consumerism allowed for new freedoms that like were unheard of in human society, particularly for women. Like suddenly we don't have to spend all day cleaning your damn clothes and cooking your damn food. Like we can suddenly like have more space in our lives for other kinds of meaning, but then consumerism sort of accommodated more space in people, or like made more space in people's lives, and then people sort of filled that space with more consumerism instead of something else. And
well, now you have social media that encourages binary thinking and judgment as like your dominant emotion.
Yeah, that's my big issue with what's going on right now, is I see a lot of the same sorts of vilification, like, you know, black and white thinking and vilification. That's I find to be something that triggers me immediately. Like as soon as someone is like, this person is the villain, this person is the bad guy, I automatically go,
right, you were the villain for a while. Yeah, that's.
And maybe I'm a little oversensitive to that, and I could like even admit to being oversensitive to that. But I think that that is something that I'm grateful that's on my radar, that I think that other people haven't like experienced like the consequences of personally. How quick whole societies can turn against you based on almost no information,
based on false information, based on speculation.
It's scary. You know? Like,
well, and based on an opinion, I think that they want to have of you anyway, right? There's people that you don't really like, so you look for just one scrap of evidence that your feelings are justified, and that's
confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is one of the scariest cognitive biases for me. And I'm constantly confirmation biasing, seeing it in the world. I have confirmation bias of confirmation bias, which is a joke that my dear friend and mentor John Ronson made in his wonderful book, The Psychopath Test. He was like, as soon as I learned about confirmation bias, I started seeing it everywhere.
And if you don't know, because I'm active on Twitter, so I know the terms virtue signaling, and I know the terms obviously confirmation bias, but I often forget that a lot of people aren't on it as much as I am. And just to briefly explain, like confirmation bias, the best example I ever had was like, you buy a Subaru and then all of a sudden you start noticing all the other Subarus out there. So you start thinking, wow, a lot of people have Subarus, and really no more people have Subarus than the day before you bought your own Subaru. It's essentially what it is. Virtue signaling, though, that is a confirmation bias has been around forever. Virtue signaling, I feel like, is a word, or is a phrase that has really gained in popularity with the rise of Twitter. And I don't know. What's that?
And all social media.
All social media. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the concept was always around, and going back hundreds of years, thousands of years, like there were lots of ways that people would sort of display to their community that they were a morally fit member worthy of respect,
right,
and admiration, whether that was dumping the victim into the volcano, or wearing a cross around your neck,
or covering head to toe in black.
Lots of things people do to say, look, I'm a virtuous person. But the thing that's different on social media is that you get immediate little happy cookie rewards. You get the likes and the retweets. So there's a stimulus response thing that is a very quick cycle. And the response, you can do it to total strangers.
And it's total strangers, and it's not a very nuanced thing, because on social media, it's or
yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so Like, what does this mean? What does this mean? I don't know. I guess
mean, even the fact that so many people on Twitter have to put in their bio, retweets are not endorsements, shows how like sort of
yeah.
And I retweet things all the time that I don't agree with, but I think are thought-provoking.
Yeah.
That made me have an interesting mental thought loop that I maybe hope someone else would want to go on. It doesn't mean I agree with the thesis of whatever that thing was. But
so let's talk about
mechanism, you know?
There's something that's happening at the New York Times right now, which I find really interesting. And it was all started by the Tom Cotton editorial. He's a United States senator who essentially was just endorsing the idea of sending in the National Guard to take care of all these protests. And it was run
the protests.
The violent, right? The riots, as he would describe it. Right. So you know we're talking about Minneapolis and then there was an outcry, just because it was published, and then James Bennett, who was oversaw the editorial department, stupidly admit that he never read it. Like, how many of us have faked a book report? Like, you just pretend that you did, and then and he of course resigned, and now there's just this sort of revolution when it comes to the editorial department in the New York Times, where there's two ideas. It's clearly a left-leaning publication, and they are debating whether or not ideas like Tom Cotton's are worthy of any sort of page space whatsoever, or because a lot of people saw it as inciting violence, should they just not?
Like a question of worthiness, right? Like, it's not a question of worthiness. The question is it socially responsible and safe to publish his opinion? Because the opinion was that his opinion is a violent act against people. So
I mean, the protest of all the staffers was publishing this op-ed puts Black New York Times staff in danger.
So it's not about like, is it worthy? It's about, is it dangerous? That's what.
And I think there's a clear answer for me, and it's that no, it's not dangerous. That words are very, very rarely directly dangerous in that way that's worth policing. And that, hey,
Terry's here.
Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Hi. Nice to meet
Terry's
you.
been having some Wi-Fi issues.
Pleasure's all mine. I have a hell of a story once you're finished.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's, Chris, you're finishing up your point on, because you're right. That's what I saw.
I think
a lot of people
if you're so worried that an idea is so, if you believe your idea is better, let it win in the marketplace of ideas. And the thing that bothers me is this notion that like Tom Cotton's bad idea will be so seductive that it will convince a bunch of people. Like, if you really think it's such a bad idea, why are you so worried about people hearing it? Let that idea flounder on its own merits or lack of merits. And I think the other reason that it makes it that's worth publishing is the thing he pointed out, which is that a large chunk of America believes that.
57%.
56%, according to that poll, think that sending in the National Guard is a reasonable idea. We should be talking about that, why people think that's a reasonable idea. We should be talking about that and putting it on the table and dissecting it, not hiding it and pretending that no one thinks that.
Yeah,
because a lot of people think that, apparently.
Yeah, and I think the problem is, like, there are a lot of ideas that may not be, fit ideas, but refusing to engage with ideas that you don't think are fit is not the best way of defeating ideas. In fact, it's a weird way of bolstering unfit ideas. And that's the kind of thing where it's like, you need to be able to look at what's wrong with something and to really just genuinely look at what's wrong with it in order to come up with solutions for it. And refusing to like even look at it is very, very, I think, is counterproductive. But anyway, tell me your story, Terry.
Yeah. What's your crazy story?
So you're in your car, obviously, Terry.
So
something went wrong.
Connected to what you guys have been talking about. But so I live way out in the country, and we have a hard time getting Wi-Fi. So I bought all these extenders for my house, right? But I didn't have them in my basement where I usually set up my studio to do these shows. So I was gonna be smart today. I went and bought some extra extenders for my basement, and I set it all up, and everything crashed. Like 3 minutes before you guys called. Done. So I'm panicking, franticing, and right now I am in the McDonald's driveway.
Yes.
I was like, I'm not missing this one. I got it. I drove to McDonald's.
Oh,
Yeah,
well.
I knew you lived out there, but I didn't know there was any area of the country that was like Wi-Fi cut out.
You saw that. You saw a couple of weeks we had skinheads and Nazis with rifles, right? That tells you how far out I am.
No, don't go there.
Yeah, but it's okay. So if you guys need a Happy Meal, cheeseburger, anything, let me know.
Here's this weird thing about me. So I love fast food, but I hate the shame that my wife decides to bestow upon me when I eat fast food. So I only get it when she's at work till late. Like, and then like I'll do like a check of the house just to make sure there's not one napkin with the logo on it or anything, like any sort of evidence that I've had a McDouble or something like that. And then like I'll pretend when we're talking about it, like, oh, Arby's is gross. I love Arby's.
Are you admitting that she doesn't watch the show here because you're just
that's a good point.
You're a
I
fast
think
food.
that's out of the bag now.
So there, fast food.
Yeah, let's talk about another word or another phrase that hadn't really, and it goes along with virtue signaling and confirmation bias, cancel culture. Because I've worked in two different radio environments. One that completely had this cancel culture buy-in, that people and institutions that had been around for decades are now, because of one tweet, even maybe sent 7 years ago or whatever, one insensitive occasion led their entire career to being eliminated. And then I worked in another one that doesn't believe in it at all. It's just bad people eventually get discovered. I would be curious to hear where everyone falls on that. Start with you, Terry.
I think some of the cancel culture is overdone. I think sometimes people can make mistakes and, can learn from those mistakes and can bounce back and make a difference. Like, for instance, maybe you made some mistakes 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like some of the way that they do these young athletes that are coming out and going to the NFL or the NBA or whatever, and they've made a tweet when they were 15 years old and it was stupid. They should be admonished, I think, and reprimanded, but canceled. I don't think you should be canceled by a silly mistake that you made once or twice in your past. However, if there seems to be a pattern of behavior, of attitudes, of methods of the way that you conduct yourself, I think absolutely you should be canceled. And I think there are some things that are egregious enough for you to be canceled one time. Absolutely. There are some instances, but I think, it should be a case-by-case thing. But again, how do you regulate that when it's social media? You can't regulate a mob, right? A mob of people online. So some of it I think is deserved and some of it isn't.
And there's a thrill, obviously, for people. I'm singing, an example that's always fresh in my mind because I watched a 4-part documentary on him, was Kevin Hart, who sent out some, homophobic tweets, and Dave Chappelle's got a great line about him, like, he is 4 tweets away from being a perfect person. And it's true. And after watching, his movies are shit. His stand-up, I do kind of miss like the January shitty Kevin Hart movie that didn't happen this year. But as a guy, watching the documentary, like, he looks out for his staff, like he's just dedicated to making himself better. And 4 tweets and a total of like 83 words cost him, not his career. He didn't get canceled, but cost him hosting the Oscars. And I remember that was the first time that I saw people had previously liked at least, or at least appreciated,
yeah.
just participate in the glee of bringing somebody down. There's that Schadenfreude. That's like, oh, you know, we did it. We got enough retweets at the Academy.
Makes me feel dirty, you know?
So, like, for me, this whole thing is, again, echoed by, like, all of this is informed by prison experience and the ways that we have, like, the first people who are canceled and who remain canceled from society are people who have committed crimes.
Right.
And
or been convicted of crimes.
Or have been convicted of crimes,
of
regardless of whether or not they actually committed a crime. And the glee with which we, like, cops is a great example of this. We talked about how cops should be canceled. The main reason that I think cops should be canceled is because it's bad boys, like, you know, like, they're going after the bad guys, and they're not taking into context that these are human beings who are a part of our ecosystem and our society, and that they have a whole context and a whole history that informs their behavior up to that point that cop humiliated them and on camera and arrested them. And this sort of resistance to the easy glee that we have in vilifying others and the resistance we have to seeing their context is something that I'm very sensitive to. Mm-hmm. I think accountability, though, is also an issue. And there are people who are in positions of power who are not being held accountable in the way that other people are. And there are people who are being made to be accountable. Like, there are, you know, if we're looking at the kinds of things that happen to people for doing bad things, right? Like, losing your job is very different than losing 20 years of your life to prison. Mm-hmm. However, losing your job is a big deal. Yes. And so is losing 20 of your years of your life in prison. Right. And, like, you know, I think that, like, we need to be aware that there is, like, a whole spectrum of ways that we respond to people, but also that, like, the way that we sort of gleefully want to disempower and humiliate and vilify people may be coming from a very similar place. And I'm very skeptical of that place.
Yeah. So the mob is not, you know, easy to hold to account, nor is it often reasonable. And I think a big worry for us is that when the mob calls for somebody, I don't trust that the mob is informed. I don't trust that the reasons they're calling for that person's head are proportionate to what that person did. What we're really worried about is that if you want to create a society where you're encouraging people to self-improve and to be better, become better human beings to their fellow human beings, you have to make room for apology. You have to make room for
rehabilitation.
You know,
and granted, like, a lot of people want to be rehabilitated without actually having to do any work. And, like, the prison system is a system where we see people who are trying to be rehabilitated but aren't even offered the chance. And so, again, I think if we look at these, like, what we're asking of people and comparing them to the, you know, the criminal justice system and the way that we ask people to prove that they're human beings and not monsters, and, like, the unreasonableness of it.
That's actually really good. I hadn't realized this before, but the whole mass incarceration thing, like,
this is good.
it doesn't offer. It says be rehabilitated, but then doesn't give people in prison any of the tools they need to be rehabilitated.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's almost a long-standing joke that rehabilitation is at all the goal of our prison.
Totally.
And I think it's interesting too that a lot of the people. So I've covered this movement called Ban the Box, which is you're not allowed to ask someone during a job application, at least initially. It'll come out later, but if they've been convicted of a felony, because you don't want someone's worst moment or lowest moment of their life to define them, and yet a tweet from 6 years ago can ruin you. Like, that's okay. So a lot of the people who would definitely be in support of Ban the Box would also be in support of bringing down someone like Kevin Hart, not just.
Yeah. And that's like, don't you see? It's the same.
Yeah. If apologies don't matter, if you can't, like, if saying sorry doesn't get you anywhere, you're not incentivizing people to actually change.
No,
you know.
So I got a question. I got a question for you, Amanda. So the attitude that you have now and the opinions that you have now in regards to subjects like this, if you can reflect back several years before you had your dealings with the law in Italy and the way that you kind of got railroaded through that situation, do you think you would have had the same kind of attitudes if you would not have gone through that situation? Because, I mean, and I'll explain to you why, because that's kind of where we are with some of the people now today. Like, they have never had to be in the other shoes. So being in the other shoes, how I don't know if you guys talked about this while I was having my technical difficulties, but how has the other shoe helped you form your opinions and who you are today?
Yeah, I mean, I only sort of kind of alluded to this before, but before all this happened to me, I just assumed that there were bad people and there were good people, and you sent bad people to prison, and the longer they were away, the better, because they're bad people. And I had no idea. I had no idea. I was incredibly privileged and incredibly safe, and I had a great life and a great supportive family. And I had no idea of the kinds of issues that, first of all, lead people into a life of criminality, but also that compromise a police officer's ability to be a actual servant to the community. I suddenly was thrust into a position where I was forced to see and also feel on my own life the consequences of that broken system. And I'll never forget that. It's become something that has fundamentally altered the course of my life. It's the reason why I spend so much time thinking about this and trying to, even putting myself in positions that are really uncomfortable, because like, here I am often defending even guilty people. And like, I get so much shit for talking about like the nuances of guilt and like
yeah, if she ever defends someone who's guilty, the accusation that comes from the mob is, oh, you're secretly admitting your own guilt. You were guilty all along. Why else would you be defending this rapist? It's like, well, maybe that guy's a rapist, but maybe he also doesn't deserve life in prison. Like, these things are complicated. They're nuanced. You got to, think about what's best for society, what's best for that person. Can you make that broken cog in society a functional cog in society?
And are we even trying?
Yeah.
Like, are we throwing away a human life,
So, Amanda, you know more about, obviously, prison and prison reform than any of us. Was there a time ever in America where the goal was really, we're going to put you in this box for set amount of time, and then when you get out, you're going to be better and actually be able to become a contributing member of society?
Interestingly, like, prison was established as an alternative to corporeal punishment, right? So before prison, the way that you dealt with people committing offenses against the community was you fucked them up. That was the way to do it. And instead, people who were like, no, people have souls, and like, you're not actually first of all, like, you shouldn't punish a person's body, because that's like, a body is the thing that God created. And, this was prison was a religious invention. It was people saying, if you want to deal with the soul of the human being, you have to affect the soul of the human being. So suddenly it became less about corporeal punishment, and it became about isolating and restructuring the soul within the body. And prison was a way of removing that person from society and removing them from their ability to do harm, but also removing them from any kind of influence that could bring them to continue with their criminal lifestyle, and flood them with an influence of that could, like, it wasn't that long ago where, prisons in Italy were, there were so many nuns that was their job, was to be in the prison and affecting the lives of prisoners and trying to convert and change people from their behavior, but also their belief systems. And so prison is a way to affect the soul of the human being. And What's happened though is we've moved again from wanting this to be about rehabilitation, and we've continued on with this history of retribution. Like, it's very important to our justice system to inflict suffering that is in equal measure to the suffering caused by the individual.
Mhm.
And like, we can have that argument, and we can have we can argue about whether or not there's value to that. What I've seen is that as much as that may be a thing that feels good, retribution is not actually a very effective strategy. I've seen people who are being retributed against react completely opposite to the way that we want them to respond to retribution.
Mhm.
And
the supposed healing that it does to the victims of crime or to the families of people harmed by crime is kind of hollow and fleeting. Like, you don't find true peace by watching the person who killed your family member burn. You know, you hold your anger for a little while, but it doesn't bring you peace.
yeah,
No.
then you have to go to therapy for a while.
So it's like, who are we helping by relying on punishment, you know?
Anyway, this is like a radical thought,
Yeah.
but this is just due to having lived alongside people who did horrible things, who all felt like victims, and not, without reason, regardless of their crime.
It is, and it's something that's just so. And I don't know if it's like this in other countries. Like, if you do something bad, you're a criminal, and criminals go to jail, and
And you're a criminal forever.
yeah, exactly. Right. And that's just what happens here in our prison population. I think only China is really on par with us, and it's not the kind of list that the countries that are on the list when it comes to rates of incarceration is not a list that the United States should brag to be a part of. So
No.
it seems, and yet there's never really another idea that is ever introduced.
Well, there have been other ideas. And like, what's unfortunate is, like, Angela Davis has been having other ideas for a long time, and no one's really listened, which is why what's happening right now is so important. Is like, there have been people who have been surgically diagnosing problems with these structures for a long time, and no one's listening to them. And so finally we're having some people listen. My question is, are we listening intelligently, and are we really thinking deeply about these issues, or are we just sort of jumping on the bandwagon? Because human beings are so good at jumping on the bandwagon and not thinking deeply about something.
It's also like the hurdle we're talking about here is like a harder one for people to get over. Like, right now, the debates are all about, let's stop doing injustice. Anyone sane person can agree to that. Let's stop doing injustice. If someone's being fuck, well, I know. Yeah, you would hope.
You would hope.
But like, beyond that is the question of like, okay, this person did do something fucked up. They did harm somebody. What do we do now? And like, even then, to get to the place where you say, well, let's give that person mercy. Let's try to help that person become a better person. That's even harder for people. It's easy to say, let this wrongfully convicted person out of jail. It's harder to say, let's let this actual guilty guy out of jail and find an alternative to prison that's actually going to help him be a productive member of society. Very few people are on with that latter one. You know, it's just as important.
Because the thought is like, okay, if we let that person out of jail, they're immediately going to go back to committing crimes and, reliving their own.
Don't do. If you drop them into poverty,
and you
don't give them any tools.
To let them have like housing, and you refuse them to get a job. And use them like.
If you stigmatize them as an ex-con and make life very difficult for them, then they will do more crimes, right? But what do you expect? You're not helping that person who's in one of the worst places you could be.
But when it comes to many crimes too, it's a lack of other options, right? It's not some. I mean, they're
it's not the first option.
Yeah.
Like let me risk my life.
Yeah.
Penitentiary.
Yeah. But yet it seems like we talk about this prison population of people who just love this life. Like they're the John Dillinger types for sure that just got off on the thrill of whatever sort of crimes they were involved in. But for the most part, crimes are born from desperation. And if we keep people desperate,
like born of thrill, even those that are born of thrill, like if we're looking at what the vast majority of crimes that are being committed, they're being committed by young men.
mm-hmm.
And young men are psychopaths. But they're not all like, but they don't stay that way. And like, if a person is in prison for freaking 10, 20 years, they're not the same person
we know
who like
that,
went on a spree. You know,
we know that like the certain parts of the brain that govern decision making don't fully mature until like age 25, and we know that the data shows that people age out of crime.
Yeah.
Like whatever violent crime you may have committed as a youth, like people do not go on committing violent crimes into their 30s, 40s, 50s. It drops off precipitously.
Yeah.
A tiny number of true sociopaths and serial killers will go on killing and whatever. But the vast majority of violent criminals would probably not be violent criminals after 10 years in prison.
Right.
The whole idea of life sentences for those people is just this insane kind of punishment. Like keeping 60-year-olds in prison for something they did when they were
16.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had the ability to talk to some men who were incarcerated in their early 20s and actually had their convictions overturned and released in their mid 50s, late 50s,
wow.
whatever it is. And yeah, when they talk about the person that, you know, even if they were guilty or innocent, whatever, when they talk about the person who was in the circumstance, imagine yourself at 55 talking about yourself at 22 and trying to, or 16 or whatever it is, and trying to justify your behavior. There's nobody who can look back and be like, I'm proud of the decisions that I made.
Of course.
Yeah, I'll just tell you exactly real quick before you go into it. It's like I'm in my mid 40s right now, right? And I haven't spent I've spent time in prison. Let's just say that.
Oh, you did?
I didn't. I've never been to prison. But
okay,
looking back on my early years, even as somebody that didn't go to prison, I'm like, what the hell was I thinking when I was 18?
Mm-hmm.
What the hell was I thinking when I was 20? By the grace of God, there go I. You know what I'm saying? I can easily have gone to jail or prison for some of the dumb stuff I did, or I could have been. Anything could happen, but I'm not the same person that I was when I was 18. I'm not the same person that I was when I was 22. And so obviously I was given by God the grace to still be here and overcome some of those missteps. And I don't have to be behind bars with other people who, you know, are stuck in a similar situation. And it's a sense of desperation that kind of folds over and over and over upon itself. And you're stuck with somebody at age 50 that has seen their life taken away from something stupid they did at 18.
Well, look at the data. If you hold a student back in, say, 4th grade and make them repeat the year, the devastating effects that it has on the rest of their life. So imagine putting someone in prison for an entire year at age 18, and then you're going to try to foresee the future.
Never with a year of prison, right? Like a year of prison is laughable to people. Like, no, 50 years. Like, oh my God. You know how many
5 months ago, we didn't know coronavirus existed. And that feels like a lifetime ago. So the only experience that I have with prison, other than hearing Amanda's stories, is just the fictional recreations of it, which I don't think do any good for people's opinions as well on whether or not we should have compassion for the people that are in there. Orange is the New Black, maybe being the one example, but
the one that I couldn't watch because like as soon as Piper Kerman like showed up to put herself in prison, I was just like, nope, I can't do it. I can't watch it. Oh my God. I can't go back there. I can't.
Isn't it like 7 seasons? Didn't she go for like bad checks or something? Like, why is she still there? It's kind of like MASH. Like, there's no way that it should last.
There was some drug-related,
drug
money thing. I don't know. Like, again, like victimless crime, but like she has to serve time for some reason after 10 years. Who knows?
A lot of it also, like coming back to what we were talking about meaning earlier, I feel like if you look at the very wise, aphorism, either you're selling crack rock or you got a wicked jump shot. Like that is true for a reason. It's because like it's not that you have no options. You do have the dumb McDonald's option. You do have the shitty work at fast food option, but you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah.
You're just treading water. And that's an option with no fulfillment and no life meaning and no sense of purpose. And if you want a sense of purpose, if you want to be actually climbing to a better life, there are very few options when you're trapped in poverty.
And that's one of those examples of a surgical diagnosis of a problem that has been dismissed and has been vilified, right?
There's Steven Soderbergh makes good movies sometimes and lousy movies other times, but Traffic is one of his good ones. And there is a scene where Topher Grace is talking about who he buys drugs from in the primarily black neighborhood that he goes to, and someone is trying to vilify the 16-year-old who has made the choice to sell heroin. He's like, you could make $400 in an hour or $400 in a month working at, like you mentioned, Burger King. Which one would you do? There's still capitalism involved.
To go right in line with what you're saying, that's not a movie though; it's real life.
Yeah.
I recall growing up, I lived down south, right, and playing football with a bunch of guys that were incredible athletes. 7th, 8th grade, the best athletes I had ever seen to this day at that age. And starting in 9th grade, they had an opportunity where they could go sell drugs and make money, or they could continue going to high school and chase a dream of playing football and maybe getting a scholarship, maybe going to college, and maybe going that route. And you take somebody that's been living in poverty and desperation, they have brothers and sisters and cousins all living in the same house. And am I going to keep going to football practice in 100-degree weather for a chance, like a pie in the sky chance that I can go to college and make something of myself? These guys took B. They took B and went to the streets. They used to tell me that, this is a real quote, they said they quit the game for the game. That makes sense.
It's so rational. That's the thing that's like people don't acknowledge is how rational that choice is. That is such a rational choice.
You would make it too. Anybody would make that
Anyone
choice.
would make that choice.
Yeah.
So like to vilify someone who's made that choice is dishonest, honestly. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, it's unfortunate that, I mean, that's a film that's 20 years old, but it's been a reality since in primarily black areas, between the decision to go ahead and get a job that's going to take you nowhere, and we're supposedly supposed to applaud them for that, for making the right choice, when really for themselves it's kind of the wrong choice in some ways anyway.
Reward them for making that choice,
right?
Like,
no,
like again, and then the thing that's like so frustrating about that whole problem is that instead of looking at people making the rational choice to break the law in order to make a better life for themselves, and saying, oh, maybe we need to be offering people opportunities so that they don't make that choice, we instead vilify them and criminalize them up the butt until we can force them into prison for the rest of their life. And then we go, yay, we're good and righteous. And here are 3 strikes laws. Like, it's just, it's so counterproductive.
Or weirdly, we idolize them. I mean, that when growing up, there was that, I grew up in a town of 5,000 white people. And my school was, entirely Caucasian. So, of course, everybody listened to NWA, as you do.
Sure.
And because, stuff you identify with. Right. And it was all about, for us, like, we just thought that culture was thrilling and kind of exciting, when really it's devastating. And,
there was a sense of purpose in it. There's a sense of purpose and meaning in NWA that I think disaffected, young white kids in the suburbs probably just were lacking. Like, why did they gravitate toward gangster rap? Well, the struggle that's evident in that music is something that, for however shitty of a life it represents a drive and a purpose to escape something, opposed to the kind of, what am I doing here shopping at Costco?
Right. There's also the assertiveness, right? Like, I am asserting my right to have, like, live my life my way, and I'm making it happen. And like, for the rest of us who are living in social anxiety and just like biting our fingernails about like, oh, am I going to wear a red t-shirt today? Like, what will it do? Like, it's so refreshing to hear someone say, you know what, I've got problems and I'm solving them. And I don't care what you think about how I'm solving my problems.
Right.
Like, that's cool.
And the thing about that, Amanda, I think, and it comes from, I think, exposure to different opportunities, to different lifestyles, because again, if you were raised in a home where you didn't, I mean, or in a neighborhood or in a community where, and it's being realistic, like, you know that your opportunities are very, very limited for you to ever escape that impoverished situation. Okay. You take what options are there. So, and just like if you were raised in a middle class home, you understand from your mother and father and your neighbors what your steps and what your opportunities are. I know that if I do ABC, I'm going to get XYZ because my mom did it, my grandma did it, my uncle do it, my next door neighbors did it. That's just the norm. It's par for the course, right? Because that's what I see. If I'm in an impoverished neighborhood and literally the opportunities are just not there, like you said, what do we have in these ghettos, so-called ghettos? I got a fast food restaurant, I got a liquor store, I got a gun store. Which job am I going to get that's going to change my family tree forever? Neither one. So again, it just if we give people or allow people to see. It goes back to those saying, if you knew better, you do better, right? If you see different things, if you are presented with different opportunities, you can make better decisions. You can make wiser choices to advance your life.
Yeah. That's why representation matters.
Exactly. Yeah. And I wonder if that's part of the uniting frustration that maybe is leading to a bigger movement right now is that we're all sort of feeling that hopelessness of how we're going to build the next generation of wealth. Like everyone's frustrated. The white population now is starting to empathize more with what the black population has been feeling forever, that the game is rigged, and it's rigged against everybody now. And the whole, all you got to do is work harder, 20 more hours type mindset. People just aren't buying into that bullshit anymore.
Plus, that's like a stupid mindset in the first place.
What's that?
Like, and also, like, I shouldn't have to work 80 hours a week to have a fulfilled life.
Right.
Like, I'm sorry, that's not my freaking life. Like, so
that's not a life. That's
not a life.
No, that's a slave. Like, that's.
I really hope that the current movement and the kind of Occupy movement from a few years back find a way to merge in this, because the problems with capitalism and with wealth inequality and the 1% are really deeply tied in with the problems with racial disparities. Like the people who suffer the most from that wealth inequality are people of color. You address that problem, you're helping African Americans, you're helping Hispanic people, and also like that. If we don't solve those problems, we're all going to be out of work. I think Andrew Yang is like, right about. We need to look at the automation crisis. Another one. You said there are 3 crises at the beginning of this. There's way more than 3.
Oh,
we're dealing with COVID. We're dealing with systemic police violence. We're dealing with the 2020 election coming up, where Trump, if he loses, may not relinquish power.
Yeah. Like, let's talk about like who's going to be allowed to vote and how. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
And if self-driving cars are that the technology is there right today, it's there today. If the legislation gets there to make that widespread, all of a sudden the number one most popular job, car driver, truck driver, taxi driver, Uber driver, is gone. That's a huge chunk of the workforce. And way more of us are going to be in poverty than are currently in poverty if we don't think about how to deal with that soon.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's I think we're going to wrap it on that.
Okay.
Just despair. Why not just leave on despair?
Fair. Oh,
I'm just gonna go over here to the right and see if the McRib is back yet.
America does need the McRib right now, does it?
I
We
need
really
a
do.
McRib.
Yeah.
Hold on. Get the kitten.
She's gonna get the kitty. She
Oh, you
sleeps on
got it.
top
Yeah.
of
There we go.
Baby.
There's a little
Baby.
kitten.
Baby. Over there.
Oh, no?
No, she's not up there. Sorry to give you a butt shot there.
It's for the people.
It's for the people. The people demand it.
Well, thanks everybody who tuned in. Amanda and Chris, thank you as always. It's always great to talk.
Great talking. Nice
yeah.
to meet you, Terry.
Nice to meet you guys. Finally.
You guys have never met? I just assume everyone I know knows everyone else I know.
No.
I'm
No.
terrible at that, yeah.
Like, look at his beard.
On Twitter.
He's not going anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. All right, thank you. Oh, so Terry, next week we have Don O'Neill, formerly of the Ron and Don Show.
Sweet.
He'll be on. So that should be fun. I'll be interested to hear what he has to say about things. And Amanda and Chris, anytime you guys want to come back, because at least just to see where that beard is.
Totally.
Come late July.
I vow that if the pandemic ends, I'm going back. To what it
You
was.
are really?
I goes full Dumbledore. That's
You
my
say
hope.
ends. All right. Thanks everybody. Thanks everyone who watched. This has been Burns and Holla. We'll be back next week at 6 p.m.
Right on.
Ciao.
See ya.
Bye.